Hello and welcome to the Miscast table. My name is Mons and today I'm gonna teach you how to play Warhammer Underworlds. So I start with explaining what Warhammer Underworlds is. And it's a board game made by Games Workshop, and it is a mixture between a card game and a miniature game. And if you're someone like me who loves both those genres, this is truly a match made in heaven, and I'll doubt you'll be disappointed if you decide to give this game a go. So to play the game you'll need a base set, and the most recent base set at the making of this video is the box I have here in front of me, the Nethermaze set. But this video will work just as well if you want to learn how to play Harrowdeep. However, if you want to learn how to play one of the older seasons, such as Shadespire, Nightvault, Beastgrave or Direchasm for example, this video will cover most things, but not everything, since there have been some rules changes and changes overall to the game since those sets were released. But you will be able to learn how to play those sets as well by using this video, but keep in mind that some things that I do say in this video have changed since then. And aside from the base set, you're also gonna need a friend. You could bring multiple, as it's possible to play this game with up to 4 players. But today we're gonna focus on the 1vs1 game mode, 2-player game mode, since that is the most common way to play. But I believe that's enough of an introduction. Let's take a look at how the game is actually played. And in your base set, you'll find everything you need to play a game of Warhammer Underworlds. And we will go through the contents of this box as we go, but we will start with the most important thing, and that is the Warbands. So you and your friend will need a Warband each. You'll find 2 Warbands in every starting set. And there are also quite a few Warbands that can be bought separately. There are currently over 40 Warbands you can play in Warhammer Underworlds. The Warbands come on plastic sprue, just like the regular Games Workshop miniatures, and they need to be assembled. And while they are push fit, I would recommend gluing them as well, since I find that they don't stick together as well as they should if you don't. They're also unpainted on arrival, and while there's no requirement that they need to be painted before you play a game, I think it's way more fun to play with painted models than unpainted ones, so I would recommend painting them as well. And the painting part of the game is also a lot of fun. And each model in a warband also has their own fighter cards. And the fighter card is a double-sided card, one side being blue, the other being yellow. Every fighter starts the game with the blue side, also known as the uninspired side, up. On the card you'll find everything you need to know about your fighter. Below the picture of the fighter you'll find the fighter's name. And some cards refer to certain fighters specifically by name. Below the name you have a hexagon icon that shows your fighter's movement characteristic. The number indicates how many hexes it can move. The symbol to the right of your movement characteristic shows your fighter's defensive characteristic, how many dice you roll and what result you are looking for. The red circle indicates how many wounds your fighter has, also known as the wound characteristic. Below the defensive, move and wound characteristics is your fighter's attack actions. We have the name of the attack, the range of the attack, the number of dice rolled and the result needed to succeed, and the amount of damage the attack does. Here you can also see any attack modifiers an attack might have, such as grievous, cleave, scything and so on. Below the attack actions you'll find your fighter's inspire mechanic. Fulfill this condition and your fighter will inspire, meaning that you get to turn your fighter card to the yellow side. Fighters become stronger when inspired, and some cards interact specifically only with inspired fighters. The lower right side of your fighter card contains any additional abilities or actions that your fighter might be capable of. On some fighters, this box also contains short snippets of lore. This is your fighter's warband symbol. This is only used to keep track of which fighter belongs to which warband. Below it is another small icon. This is your fighter's Grand Alliance symbol. There are 4 Grand Alliances: Order, Chaos, Destruction and Death. And some cards can only be used by certain Grand Alliances. But you'll only need to think about this when deck building. Here you can see your fighter's traits. As you can see, this fighter has the trait Leader. Some traits have inherent rules coupled with them, while some traits just causes interactions with cards. A rule of thumb is that if a trait is not covered in the rulebook, it does not come with any special rules. In the upper left corner there is a picture of the unpainted model that this fighter card represents. And this is more useful than you might think, since some fighters are hard to tell apart. The fighter card has the obvious purpose of telling you the rules for every single one of your fighters. But you also use it to place wound counters on when your fighters are damaged, place upgrade cards behind the fighter card or adjacent to it, and keeping track of inspired fighters and so on. So now that we have covered the warbands and the miniature aspect of this game, it is time to take a look at the card game aspect of this game. And to play the game, every player needs an objective deck filled with objective cards. It's these ones with the yellow card back. And you also need a power deck filled with power cards. It's the one with the blue card back here. And in your objective deck, you're gonna need at least 12 objective cards, of which no more than half can be search objectives. And your power deck needs to consist of at least 20 cards, of which no more than half can be gambits. The rest must be upgrades. And I will cover how the cards work and when they can be played a little bit later in the video when we get into the actual gameplay. And it needs to be said that deck building is a massive topic on its own, and it definitely deserves its own video. Because if I were to cover everything about deck building in this video, it would be way too long. So I won't go any deeper into the subject of deck building in this video. However, if this is your first game, I do recommend playing with the pre-built decks that come with every starter set and every Warband expansion box. These pre-built decks are called rival decks, and playing with these decks exclusively is called the Rivals format. It's a popular format played by many, and it's also a great way to learn the game as a beginner. But if you're already mixed up the cards in your starter set and are now unsure which belong to which rival deck, you can look it up online. I myself like to use Underworldsdb, and I put a link to their website in the description down below. And when you've played a few games with the rival decks and you're feeling at home with the rules, I do definitely think that you should give deck building a go. As it's here, I think the game really shows its depth and variety. And now that we have explained some of the basics of the game, it is finally time to start playing. And according to the rulebook, the first thing you're supposed to do when you start playing is that simultaneously the players each reveal the warband they've chosen to use. Which is a bit dramatic if you ask me, so I must admit that I rarely do follow this step myself. But after that, you're supposed to do a roll-off to see which player gets to pick the game board first. So now it's a good time to talk about the dice. There are 3 different kind of dice: attack dice, defense dice and magic dice. The attack dice has the following symbols: critical success or crit, smash, fury, single support and double support. The defensive die look very similar, but instead of smash and fury, it has block and dodge. The magic dice only has 3 symbols: crit, channel and focus. And we will go through how every dice works and what every symbol means shortly. But what you need to know right now is that you can use either the attack dice or the defensive die to make a roll-off. And a roll-off is done by rolling 4 dice each and then comparing the results. Start by checking who has the most crits. The player with the most crits wins the roll-off. If you have the same amount of crits, or no crits at all, check how many single support symbols each of you rolled. The one with the most wins the roll-off. If you have the same amount, or no single supports, compare the amount of double supports each of you rolled. The one with the most wins the roll-off. If you still have the same amount or none, you re-roll all 4 dice again and do the same procedure until there is a winner. In your core set, you'll find 2 of these double-sided game boards. And the winner of the roll-off can either decide to pick the board first, or he can pick the placement of the boards. Every game board is 2-sided, and you can choose to play on either side. And in a game of Warhammer Underworlds, when you're playing only 2 players, you need to use 2 game boards. So if you only have the core set, you will need to use both of the game boards that you received in that set. When setting up the battlefield, you're allowed to place the game boards in one of 2 ways. The first way in which you can place the boards is placing them short side to short side, like this. As long as 2 hexes here in the middle are connected. So this is the only way you can place the game board when playing short side to short side. You're not allowed to place the game boards like this, for example, because now only one hex here is completed. The other way in which you're allowed to place the boards is placing them long side to long side. And when you place them long side to long side, you're allowed to place them anywhere like this, as long as at least 4 hexes here are completed. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're allowed to play them like this, or like this. The game boards also have a number of special hexes. These red ones are called lethal hexes, and if you end up in one of these or pass through them in any way, you take 1 damage, with the exception of fighters with the flying trait who does not take damage from lethal hexes. The white hexes are called blocked hexes. A fighter cannot move through, stand in or see through these hexes. Once again, with the exception of a flying fighter who can move through these hexes but needs to end their movement in an empty hex. We also have these blue hexes with dotted lines that are called cover hexes. A fighter that stands in one of these hexes counts the double support symbol as a success in their defensive role, even if they have no supporting fighters. The game board that you choose is your territory, and the game board your opponent chooses is his or hers territory. The hexes where your game boards and your territories meet are called no one's territory. The incomplete hexes on the edge of the game boards are called incomplete hexes and are not part of the playing field. And the complete hexes on the outer rim are called edge hexes. And finally, we have hexes with this symbol. This indicates that the hex is a starting hex. And when it's time to place your fighters, you may place them in any starting hex in your territory. So we make a roll off, and the winner either gets to decide if he wants to pick the game board first, or he gets to pick the game board second, but gets to pick the placement of the boards. So now that we have set up our battlefield, it is time to place our feature tokens. And you'll find these in your starter set. So the feature tokens are these double-sided hexagonal tokens that are numbered 1 until 9. You'll see that on one side you have the objective, and on the other side you have a Gloom hex. But when you are playing the game with only 2 players, you only need 5 objectives. So I'm gonna remove these with the numbers 6 until 9. So you take the feature tokens numbered 1 through 5 and you mix them with the Gloom side up. So you don't know which objective is which. And then you give 3 to the player who shows the game board first and 2 to the player who shows the placement of the boards. And the player with 3 feature tokens start placing one of his. And it can be placed anywhere on the board as long as it abides by these rules. The first rule is that the objective must be placed Gloom side up. The second rule is that it cannot be placed in a Gloom hex, a starting hex, a lethal hex, a blocked hex, or an edge hex. It also cannot be placed within 2 hexes of another token. So if when I placed this token here, there were to have been another token here, this would have been too close, since it's only 1 hex between these. But here, for example, where it's at least 2 hexes between these two, it would have been alright. And the final rule is that if at some point you have run out of space and cannot place a token without breaking a rule, then you're allowed to place it in an edge hex. Like this, for example. So the players have taken turns and placed their feature tokens, and now the battlefield looks something like this. And after these feature tokens that are one side with the Gloom and one side with the objective have been placed, you have another kind of hex. But these feature tokens are Gloom on both sides. Each player may place one of these each, but you don't have to. You can forgo placing these, unlike the objective tokens. And you start with the player that shows the first board once again. So let's place one of these over here, and then we say that the other player forgoes placing his or hers to keep things simple. So now our battlefield is ready and it's time to draw some cards. So let's start by shuffling both our power deck and our objective deck. And after the decks have been thoroughly shuffled, it is time to draw 5 power cards. And after that we draw 3 objective cards. And this is your starting hand. After you have received your cards, you're allowed to look at your hand and decide if this is something that you want to keep or not. Otherwise you can discard your cards and make a mulligan. And how the mulligan works in this game is that you're either allowed to discard all of your power cards, or all of your objective cards, or both all your objective cards and all your power cards. You're not allowed to keep any individual cards. It is all or nothing. So let's say I like my objective cards, but I'm not that happy with my power cards. I can decide that I keep my 3 objectives, but I'm going to discard and mulligan my power cards. I'm discarding the 5 power cards. I do not mix them into the power deck just yet. And I draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new cards. And you're only allowed to mulligan once, so after I've drawn my 5 new power cards, I take the 5 cards that I discarded and I shuffle them once again into my power decks. So the cards that I discarded are still going to be in my deck. They're not going to be thrown away or in my graveyard, as you would say maybe in Magic the Gathering. And now that we have our starting hand, it is time to place the fighters onto the battlefield. And to see which player gets to place their fighter first, we need to make a roll-off in the way I described before. So we make a roll-off, and here we see that one player has 2 crits against the other player's single crit. So the player with the white die get to decide who gets to start placing their fighters. One thing that's important to know is that the player who places all of their fighters first gets 1 extra innate crit when you make the final roll-off before the game starts. But of course, if you start placing your fighters, then your opponent has an information advantage because you're the one placing first and they can react to that. So we start placing the fighters, taking turns in this manner. All of the fighters of course need to be placed in a starting hex. You cannot place them anywhere else. Something like that. And as said before, now that we have placed all of our fighters, it's time to make one final roll-off where the player who placed their fighters first have 1 innate crit to this roll. And the player who wins the roll-off gets to decide if they want the first activation or if they want the second activation, but then also the last activation. So both choices comes with pros and cons. But let's stop here and explain some stuff. The game is played over 3 rounds. Each round consisting of 8 turns, 4 for you and 4 for your opponent. And the turn consists of 2 parts. 1 activation step, in which you get to activate and use your fighters, and a power step, in which you get to play power cards. And right now all of that might seem a little bit complicated, but it really isn't. So I'm gonna walk us through a turn or 2 so we can see how it looks in practice. So let's set the scenario here. I am playing my Yaris Purifiers, and I'm facing off against my opponent's Shadeborn. We have just placed our fighters, and we have made the final roll-off, which I won. And I have decided that I want the first turn. So what happens now is that we go into the activation step of my turn 1. And in my activation step, I can do one of the following things. I can move a fighter, attack with the fighter, charge, guard, draw a power card, discard an objective card and then draw an objective card, pass and do nothing, or in some cases a fighter has an action on their fighter card or on an upgrade card that can be used as an activation. When a fighter makes a move action, it may move as many hexes as its movement characteristics, but you're not allowed to end the move action in the same hex as you started the move action in. A fighter that has made a move action immediately receives a move token. And a fighter with a move token cannot make a move action or a charge action. What attack actions your fighters are capable of is specified on their fighter cards. We talked about the fighter cards earlier in this video, but here's a short recap. This indicates the range of the attack. This is the damage of the attack, and this is how many dice you roll for the attack action. And this is the result that you need to succeed with the attack action. And here you'll find any attack modifiers. To be able to make an attack action, you need to 1. Be in range, and 2. Have line of sight. There's a really good diagram for how line of sight works in the rulebook, so I'm gonna use the same example here. This fighter can see all the hexes with the yellow dots, but not the ones with the grey dots. Most of the time, line of sight is pretty straightforward. But there is this hex here, and this is where most line of sight mistakes occurs, since it looks like this model could partly see the fighter standing here. But if you cannot draw a line from the center of a hex to the center of another hex without intersecting a blocked hex, you do not have line of sight. And in this case, just touching the edge of the blocked hex when drawing said line counts as intersecting it. But enough about line of sight, let's take a look at the attack action. And it's actually quite simple. You declare that you want to attack a target that is within range and within line of sight. You roll as many dice as your fighter card or upgrade card specifies, and then your opponent gets to roll as many defensive dice as their fighter card specifies, and then you compare the results. First, compare the amounts of crits you have. If the attacker has more crits than the defender, the attack action succeeds. If the defender has more crits, it fails. If you have the same amount or none, compare the other regular successes. And as said before, it's indicated on your fighter cards what results you need to be successful in both attack actions and defensive rolls. But there are other ways of getting successful rolls. Both the attacker and the defender can have supporting fighter. This symbol indicates 1 supporting fighter, and this symbol indicates 2 supporting fighters. You're allowed to count these successes if you have 1 or more supporting fighters, and these if you have 2 or more supporting fighters. The attacker receives support for every friendly fighter that is adjacent to the target of their attack action. And the defender receives support for every friendly fighter that is adjacent to the attacker. And all successes, except for critical successes, have the same value. So if the attack action is not settled after comparing the crits, you compare all the regular successes. If the attacker has more, the attack succeeds, and the target is dealt as much damage as is specified in the attack action. Give the target a wound counter for every point of damage it was dealt. If a fighter has more wound counters or the same amount of wound counters as its wound characteristic, it is taken out of action. When this happens, you remove the fighter and all its counters from the battlefield. A fighter that is removed this way cannot be activated, inspired, or in any other way interacted with, unless a card specifically says that you can interact with a fighter that is out of action. And if a fighter is taken out of action that has a wound characteristic of 4 or less, the opposing player receives 1 unspent glory point, and it's this token here. But if you take a fighter with a wound characteristic of 5 or more out of action, you instead receive 2 unspent glory points. And when a glory point has this side up, it is an unspent glory point, and when it has this side up, it is a spent glory point. And I'm gonna talk a bit more about how you spend glory points in a while, but there are a few things you should know about the glory points. And that is that the player with the most amount of glory points at the end of the game is considered to be the winner. And you should also know that a spent glory point and an unspent glory point has the same value when you're calculating the final score in the end of the game. But back to the attack action. If it's taken out of action, the fighter is removed and the attack action ends. But if the defender survives, you're allowed to drive them back, which means you can move them 1 hex away from the attacker. But you may not move them closer, or just move them in such a way that they're the same distance away. And remember that you don't have to drive them back, but you are allowed to do so if you want to. If the defender has more successes than the attacker, the attack action fails and the activation ends. If the attacker and defender have the same amount of successes, but each rolled at least 1 success, the attack fails, but the attacker is still allowed to drive the target back as described earlier. If neither the attacker nor the defender rolled any successes at all, you're not allowed to drive the target back and the attack action fails. And this is basically how attacking works. There are some weird cases that I didn't cover in this video, like what happens for example if a fighter is suddenly out of range in the middle of an attack action, or what happens if a fighter cannot be driven back because of how it's placed. And in those cases you'll have to consult the rulebook, because once again the video will be way too long if we look into all of those cases. But 95% of the time the attack action works just as explained. But there is one more thing that we should cover when we talk about attack actions, and that is attack modifiers. And there's two really important ones that you need to keep in mind in my opinion. There are more, but I'm gonna cover the most important ones in my opinion. And those are ensnare and cleave. And when you're targeted by an attack action that has the attack modifier ensnare, the arrows or the dodge symbols in your defensive roll does not count as successes. And the same goes with cleave. When you're targeted by an attack action that has the attack modifier cleave, your block rolls or your shield rolls does not count as successes in your defensive roll. There are more attack modifiers out there, but in my opinion these are the two most important ones, and if any other come up you can check them up in the rulebook. Then we have the charge action. A charge action is what is called a super action, which is two actions combined into one. A charge action consists of a move action followed by an attack action. When you make a charge action, first follow the rules for a move action, then follow all of the rules for an attack action. The exception is that you give the fighter a charge token instead of a move token as soon as the movement part of the charge action is completed. A fighter with a charge token cannot be activated. Guard action. Give a fighter a guard token. A fighter with a guard token counts both blocks and dodges as successes in their defensive rolls, and a fighter that is on guard cannot be driven back. However, a fighter loses its guard token if it makes a charge action. You get to draw a power card. Simple as that. You start by discarding an objective card that you have on hand, and then you draw a new one. You are allowed to pass and just do nothing, but it's rarely recommended. There are some upgrades that have actions attached to them, and some fighters that have actions on their fighter cards. These actions can also be performed in your activation. Just follow the instructions written on the card. So let's back things up a little bit. I won the roll off, I chose to go first, making it my first activation. And let's say I decide to make a move action onto this objective. I move there and I receive a move token. And after I made my activation, both me and my opponent are allowed to do two things in the following order. First, we are allowed to inspire our fighters if we have fulfilled any of the inspire mechanics on their fighter cards. And in this case, neither of us have. After that, we are allowed to score any search objective cards that we have fulfilled the scoring condition for, of which I have none. And then we transition into the power step, in which you take turns playing power cards, starting with the player who has the next activation, which is my opponent. So for example, he could play Suffocating Mist onto my fighter in this hex here. Choose one enemy fighter that is in a cover hex and deal 1 damage to the chosen fighter. So when that happens, I take a wound counter and put it on the fighter card for Alien that was targeted by Suffocating Mist. And that also makes it my turn to play power cards if I want to. And in this step, you're allowed to play upgrades onto your fighters as well. However, to do so, you need to spend an unspent glory point. And since it's the beginning of the game, I don't have any glory points, therefore making me unable to do so. But in this step, aside from playing power cards, you're also allowed to delve feature tokens that you are standing on. So I could choose to delve this Gloom hex from a Gloom hex into an objective. And since I am standing on this objective, I am considered to be holding it. And holding an objective comes with no inherent benefits in of itself, but a lot of the cards played revolve around objective holding. And if there's still a tie at the end of the game, one of the conditions for tiebreakers is which player are holding the most objectives. So if you're expecting a tie at the end of the third round, holding a few objectives might be a good idea. And after both players have passed on the opportunity to play a power card or to delve an objective, the power step ends. And before you go into the opponent's first activation, you are allowed once again to do one of the following. You're allowed to inspire your fighters if possible, and 2, you're allowed to score any search objectives that you can score. And after my turn has ended, I take my turn counters. You can of course set these up before the game. But you take one of your turn counter and you turn it over to indicate that you have played your first out of 4 rounds and that there are 3 rounds remaining. And I highly recommend that you use this because it's super easy to lose track of how many turns you have played when you're focused on the game. So I would recommend using the turn counters. And then it's my opponent's first activation. And let's say he makes a charge action. So he makes first a move action over here, he receives a charge token, and then he makes an attack action against Alien. And in this case he's making the Cruel Blade attack, rolling 2 dice, looking for hammers and dealing 2 damage. So let's roll that. And he gets 1 success. And Alien, which he is targeting, has 1 defensive die. And she receives 1 support, but she has no supporting fighters. So the attacker has 1 successful and the defender has 0. So the attack action goes through. So this means that Alien receives another 2 wound counters, which puts her at 3 wound counters, which is the same as her wounds characteristics, meaning that she is now taken out of action. So she is removed from the board, placed on her fighter card, and her token is removed as well. And since Alien was a fighter with a wound characteristic of 4 or less, my opponent receives 1 unspent glory point for taking her out of action. And my opponent's activation is over, and now we go over to the power step, but first we need to check the inspire and the search mechanic. And now my opponent has actually fulfilled their inspire mechanic. Since the fighter that they attacked with, Slear Greyblood, has the inspire mechanic, this fighter makes an attack action against an enemy fighter with 1 or more wound counters. And since the fighter Alien received a wound counter from the card Suffocating Mists, she did indeed have a wound counter at the time of the attack action. So my opponent gets to flip over Sylark's card and he becomes Sylark Inspire. And when a fighter inspires, it usually gets a bit stronger. This fighter, for example, gains an extra defensive die, the snare ability on his repeater bow, and his shadow mark ability is replaced with the shadow ambush ability. And after the inspire step comes the surge step. And now my opponent has the ability to score an objective card. Surge and duel. Score this immediately if a friendly fighter's attack action takes the target out of action, which it did, and that friendly fighter has no wound counters, which he doesn't have, or that friendly fighter is an assassin, which he also is. So my opponent has fulfilled the objective to be able to score this card, which you of course want to do, scoring it and netting him 1 extra unspent glory point. And after you score a search objective card, you are once again allowed to draw a new objective card. But now we should talk quickly about the different kind of objective cards. There are 2 different objective cards, one of which is search objectives, and it says on their card search. And it's only these objectives that you're allowed to score in between the turns. The other regular objectives you're only allowed to score at the end of an entire round. But if a card is a search objective, it either says search or it says score immediately. And if the card has neither of those, it is an objective card that you're only allowed to score at the end of a round. And we will talk about how those works when we get there in a second. And after the surge step, we go once again into the power step, where we are allowed to play power cards and delve our feature tokens. And since it's my turn next, I have priority and I can decide if I want to play any power cards, delve any objectives, or just pass. But in my hand I have a gambit spell. I have the card Quintox Bow. And it reads like this: Gambit spell. lightning. If cast, choose one friendly fighter within 4 hexes of the caster. -1 damage to attack action that target the chosen fighter to a minimum of 1. And the chosen fighter has the flying trait. The effect persists until the chosen fighter is dealt damage. And it also says here on the bottom that it's restricted to this symbol, which means wizard. And if we look at my fighter cards, I do have one fighter that is a wizard, and that is Miyari Lightcaller, my leader. And the symbol here next to his name indicates that he is a wizard, and the number to the right of that symbol indicates what wizard level he is. And in this case he is a level 2 wizard, which means that he gets to roll 2 magic die when trying to cast a spell. If he were a level 1 wizard, he would only be allowed to cast 1 magic die. If he were a level 3 wizard, he would be allowed to cast 3 magic die. So I am allowed to roll 2 magic die, and on the spell card here you can see what result I need for the spell to be successfully cast. And in this case I'm going to need 1 lightning. So if I roll the die, I get a crit and a lightning. So these are double success, and my casting roll is successful. So I can choose to give Quintox Bubble onto my archer over here, Senella, because she is within 4 hexes of the caster. So a few things could have happened here. If I were to have rolled 2 crits, then the spell would still have been successfully cast, but my wizard would have suffered backlash. If you roll 2 or more crits, your wizard suffers backlash. And when a wizard suffers backlash, they are dealt 1 damage. But if the wizard survives the backlash damage, the spell is still successfully cast. If they die from the backlash damage, the spell fizzles and is not cast. And of course, if I were to have rolled something like this, and no lightning, no successes, then the spell would have failed as well. And one thing you need to know about spells: if you don't have a wizard on the battlefield, you cannot cast spells. And not every warband have a wizard in their warband. So before you put any spells into your deck, you need to make sure that you actually have a wizard. And if your wizard is removed as a casualty and removed from the table, then you cannot cast spells anymore, so they are effectively dead cards at that point. And after I have cast my spell, it's now my opponent's turn to play any power cards if he would like, and he has now 2 unspent glory points, so you can choose to spend 1 and give great strength to Drusilla Visorex. And she has the attack action Glaive and Dagger. It's a range 2 attack action, rolling 3 dice, looking for swords or fury, and it deals 2 damage. But now, because of great strength, which modifies range 1 and range 2 attack actions, she now deals 3 damage with the attack action Glaive and Dagger. And then both of us passes. It is the Inspire step, the Surge step, and then it's my second activation. And we keep playing like this, taking turns, until both of us has played 4 turns each. And then we head on into the end phase, starting with the player that took the first turn. But just before we head into the end step, there is one final Inspire step where we are allowed to inspire our fighters if possible. And since I had the first turn, I also start in the end step. And you start the end step by scoring any objectives that you can possibly score. And after you have scored those objectives and received the glory points for them, you're also allowed to discard any objectives that you do not wish to keep. Usually because you've been put in a position where they are very difficult or impossible to score. So let's say I discard one objective. After that, I am allowed to play as many upgrades as I can onto my fighters, depending on how many upgrades I have on hand and how many unspent glory points I have, because I still need to spend the glory points to give a fighter an objective in this step. So let's say I give one of my fighters an upgrade, and then I'm once again allowed to discard any power cards that I do not wish to keep. After I've done both of those things, I am allowed to draw objective cards until I have 3 objective cards on hand, and I'm allowed to draw power cards until I have 5 power cards on hand. And after I've done all of these things, it is my opponent's turn to do the same. He gets to score any glory cards, receive the glory points, discard any glory cards he doesn't like. He can also give his fighters upgrades, discard any action cards that he doesn't like, and then he draws new cards. It is time for a roll-off to see who gets to go first in round 2. So you make a roll-off in the same way as we have described earlier, and the player who wins the roll-off gets to decide if he takes the first activation or the second activation, but also the last activation. And before you head into the first activation of the upcoming round, of round 2, you once again have a step where you are allowed to inspire your fighters if possible. And the final thing you should do before you head into the next round is to clean up all the tokens on the battlefield. And that includes move tokens, charge tokens, and so on. All these tokens are now removed and does not carry over into the next round. After that, round 2 is played exactly the same way as round 1, each of you taking 4 turns and then heading into the end step. And after the third end phase, you count up your glory points, and the player with the most glory points wins. And remember that spent and unspent glory points have the same value. Spending a glory point does not expend them in any way. If there's a tie after you counted up the glory points, but one player has 0 fighters on the battlefield and the other player has at least 1, the player with remaining fighters on the battlefield wins. But if both players have fighters remaining on the battlefield, or none of the players have fighters remaining on the battlefield, it is still a tie. And in that case, you check which player is holding the most objectives. And the player holding the most objectives wins. If none of you are holding any objectives, or you're holding the same amount, it is still a tie, and then the game is considered to be a draw. And you need to remember one thing here. Even if your opponent kills all of your fighters, that does not mean that you have lost. The same way goes if you kill all of your opponent's fighters, that does not mean that you have won. In the end of the game, the player with the most glory points wins, no matter how many fighters they have left. That said, killing your opponent's fighters rewards you with glory points and reduces the amount of actions they can take. But killing their fighters alone does not guarantee victory. And this is how you play Warhammer Underworlds. There are quite a few rules, mechanics and interactions that I did not cover in this video because it will make it way too long. But if you stumble upon some that I didn't cover in this video, you can always consult the rulebook. And if this video is well received, I can make a video covering some more advanced rules. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, comment some feedback and what you want to see in the future. And if you haven't already, I will be really happy if you subscribe to this channel. And I'll see you all in a future video. But most importantly, I wish you welcome to the Underworlds. Bye.